I have to locate my wife because if I'm not loud enough, she says she'll wave me, do something like this, you know. But, yeah, actually, if you've never stood up here after the talk, you ought to come up here. It's kind of tight up here. You got this over here, and they got the microphone on this side, and it's not as easy as it might look. Yeah, so tonight is Lewis on belief that God exists. And what I'm going to go over is not something about which you should think that, oh, I have to go through all this. Lewis was well aware that the majority of human beings don't have time, in a sense, to go through what he was going through. Remember, he's an academic, okay? And he's encountering in his academic life a lot of ideas, and they're giving him reason to reflect a good bit. We'll see that the topics of the first two talks are very relevant to tonight, so that Lewis didn't come to believe that God exists in a vacuum. In other words, it just didn't pop up like that. As we'll see, Lewis thought that he was a supernatural being, okay? And so that coming to believe that God exists was the belief in another supernatural being, but it arose out of his thoughts about himself. I didn't teach very often over the years philosophy of religion. I actually tried to avoid teaching it because, well, I won't say why, but in many classes, not just philosophy of religion, I would have students, they just like to talk about God sometimes, and some students would say, not just some, quite a few actually, would say, well, if God would only show himself or make himself readily evident, something like that, then I would believe that God exists. And they'd often say this about the afterlife. Well, if I get in the afterlife, I'll know then whether God exists. And I said, oh, because it'd make me think, and I would wonder, and I would say to them, well, let's assume you get on the other side of the grave and there's an afterlife. What happens if you saw me standing there with a big G on my shirt? Would you believe God exists? And they go, oh, no. And I said, well, what happens if you get there and I can make coins just appear out of midair? Would that convince you that God exists? And they look, no. And I said, well, just what do you think would convince you that God exists? And they would, usually they're sitting down at this, in their seats. It's clear, they've never really thought about this. What would convince them that God exists? And I was trying to illustrate to them, is it actually going to be something visible that's going to convince you that God exists? Is there going to be something tangible? You're going to touch something and go, oh yeah, God exists. Just how are they thinking about this? And it leads me to wonder, how to think about it. Now, Lewis at one point wrote, to avoid considering the question of God's existence, just avoid it if you want to. Here's what he recommended. I'll just quote him here. Avoid silence, avoid solitude, avoid any train of thought that leads off the beaten track, concentrate on money, sex, status, health, and above all, your own grievances. Keep the radio on. Live in a crowd. Use plenty of sedation. If you must read books, select them very carefully, but you'd be safer to stick to the newspapers. You'll find the advertisements there helpful, especially those with a sexy or a snobbish appeal. So in other words, Lewis thought, if you're serious about this, and you have the time to actually be serious about it, turn off the radio, we would say today, turn off the internet, find a place of quiet, read carefully, I think he would say talk with others, and you might at that point begin to reach some serious reflection about these matters. Now, I have on my outline, which is totally outdated already, the meaning of life question. The first two talks after the movie, or the film, or whatever it is, Lewis thought about the meaning of life. He was like everybody else on this. He thought about it in generally three categories. What's the purpose of life? We saw that last week. He thought it was to be perfectly happy. He also thought about what makes life worth living, and he gave the same answer. Happiness is what makes life worth living. When he came to kind of try and wrap this all up, he thought about the meaning of life in terms of what makes sense. What makes sense? And he wrote the following in his book, Miracles. We are beings, he says, who have some innate sense of the fitness of things, which expresses itself, he said, in the folk imagination of natural appetite for impressive unity. So he thinks all of us here tonight have an innate sense of the fitness of things. We seek to fit things together, and when we fit things together, in certain ways, they make more sense than in other ways. And so Lewis, I think, concluded belief that God exists is the result of reasoning about how do things best fit together. And I should say, before I go on any further, Lewis never, best of my knowledge, and I think I've read everything that we have that he wrote, he never just wrote a treatise on belief that God exists. You have to kind of glean, you got to pick and put it together to make, dare I say, sense out of it. Now, Lewis thought belief that God exists is really, as I have here in the second bullet point, something about for which it's hard to produce good arguments at the popular level. And when I go over what I'm going to go over, you'll say, yeah, that's not at the popular level. And he was suspicious, in a way, of science. People often make appeals to theoretical science, and Lewis thought that science was something, if it's genuinely understood, science can change. And so that he thought, in reflecting about the existence of God, it wasn't advisable to go to science. And I'll just read you a quote. This is from his book, God in the Dock. There's an essay in there. In one respect, as many Christians have noted, contemporary science has recently come into line with Christian doctrine, parted company with classical forms of materialism. If anything emerges clearly from modern cosmology, Big Bang type theory, he doesn't use the word Big Bang, this is what he has this idea in mind, is that nature is not everlasting. The universe had a beginning and will have an end. But the great materialistic systems of the past all believed in the eternity and thence in the self-existence of matter. And he says this fundamental way of looking at things has been withdrawn. At the moment, he says, it appears that the burden of proof rests not on us, but on those who deny that the universe has a cause of its existence. And then he says the endless fluctuations of scientific theory, which seem today so much friendlier to us than in the last century, may turn against us tomorrow. So I think science is something you might want to seize on and say, look what science says. Which is, look, if we actually understand science, you could wake up tomorrow and the headlines could read something like this. The Earth is the center of the solar system. Because scientific theory changes. So what he was looking for in belief that God exists was not knowledge of something that of what the knowledge is of, what it's about could change. He was looking for something that was firm, that was unchanging, that remained the same through time. And here's where he settled on himself. And he thought that it's in reasoning, now this was the subject matter of the first talk, in reasoning, there's change going on. We're moving from premises to conclusions, but nevertheless, it's the same self that understands how we're moving from premises to conclusions. And I'm just going to read you a couple quotes here to give you a flavor of what he's talking about. This is in his letters. He says this to someone, conversion and regeneration are essentially different from the idea of substitution of one thing for another. So in other words, in conversion, regeneration, we're not substituting one self for another self. Rather, the same self exists before the conversion and after the conversion. It basically persists or subsists through time as the very same thing. It's what we might think of personality traits might change from the pre-converted self to the converted self, but it's the same self that persists through time. Here is his example from his book on the problem of pain. Suppose that three sensations follow one another, A, B, then C. When this happens to you, you have the experience of passing through the process A, B, C. But note what this implies. It implies that there's something in you which stands sufficiently outside B to notice B now beginning to and coming to fill the place which A has vacated, and something which recognizes itself as the same through the transition from A to B and B to C. So it can say, I have had the experience of A, B, C. Now this something is what I call soul. The simplest experience of A, B, C as a succession demands a soul, which is not itself a mere succession of states, but rather a permanent bed along which these different portions of the stream of sensation roll, and which recognizes itself as the same beneath all of them. So Lewis, you're here listening to me tonight. Might be saying, let's get this over with, Getz. But you're listening to me speak different words, express different ideas, and you're trying, now what you're experiencing is one sound succeeding another, one idea expressed by these sounds succeeding another. And Lewis says what this implies is There's a soul that undergirds all this, and it is the subject of all of this change. And he thinks, now again, whether you agree or disagree with him is a totally separate matter. He thinks this is the basis for belief that God exists. So, how do you concisely summarize Lewis's view? Lewis's view is something like this: I believe I exist, therefore I believe God exists. So Lewis is someone who moves from belief in himself, his own existence, to the existence of what we call God. No, I'm about number the fourth bullet point down here, knowledge of the soul, with its capacity to reason, assures us that a supernatural entity exists. Now, this was the first lecture. When I'm reasoning, I'm aware of myself enduring through all the reasoning, and we went through on the first talk. I'm sure it left some of you confused, but the idea was there's a certain kind of mental explanation that goes on in reasoning. Apprehension of ideas causes apprehension of other ideas, and Lewis concludes that he's a soul, is a supernatural being. So he, first of all, realizes, he says, I am a supernatural being. I don't move from the non-supernatural to God. Rather, I move from myself. I'm a supernatural being, and I'm going to conclude that there's another supernatural being called God. And again, this is so out of step with the contemporary academic world. Okay, I read you last week Paul Bloom, psychologist up at Yale, and just learned recently he's also at the University of Toronto. Remember, what is the first thing Bloom says? I read this to you last week, and I believe I mentioned it the week before. What's the first thing you learn when you go into Psychology 101? There is no soul. Now, Lewis, he tells us, I'm a person who's totally out of step with the modern world. If you learn that in Psych 101, Lewis, I think he would say, you're going to have a hard time getting to a belief that God exists. So if Bloom is right, theism, the belief that the idea that God exists, is going to be hard to reach. Now, what is it about ourselves that's so interesting to Lewis? Now, again, I'll talk plural here, ourselves, but he's thinking of this first person. He says, I'm aware that I exist, but I'm also aware that I don't have to exist. I'm aware that I exist, but I'm also aware that I don't have to exist. Philosophers have a fancy term for this. They call it a contingent being. Contingent being. A being which exists but need not exist. And Lewis, in just self-knowledge now, he realizes that he exists, but he also realizes, I don't have to exist. So then the question, again, he doesn't choose for this question to arise, it just arises. Well then, what explains my existence? If I exist, but I don't have to exist, what explains my existence? And he concludes the being that explains his existence is God. Now I'm going to read a quote here from Miracles, And he says this, the belief in a supernatural reality can neither be proved nor disproved by the use of our five senses. We can't prove the existence of supernatural reality by the use of our five senses. So anybody who's going around looking for God, looking to taste something, smell something, see something, Lewis's view is we don't get to acknowledging supernatural reality that way. Arguments for existence, he says, are metaphysical. They're prior to all this. And he actually says, to me, they're conclusive. They turn on the fact that even to think and act in the natural world, we have to assume something. In order to think, we must claim our own reasoning, a validity which is not credible if our own thought is merely a function of our brain. This is the whole point of the first talk. And our brain's a byproduct of irrational processes. The concept of nature itself is one we've reached only tacitly by claiming a sort of supernatural status for ourselves. He says, you must argue for supernaturalism from the outset. You must recognize I'm a supernatural being, and then you'll get to the existence of God. When do we meet God? Where we meet God, in Lewis's view, in our own self. When do we meet God? Lewis says, in the very present moment. When he was discussing revelation in history, he wrote the following: we all have a certain but direct access to history. We are allowed, indeed compelled, to read it sentence by sentence, and every sentence is labeled now. I mean the real or primary history which meets each of us moment by moment in his own experience. It is very limited, but it is the pure, unedited, unexpurgated text straight from the author's hand. God is at every moment revealed in the holy present. Now, what did he say the devil's trying to do? The devil's task is to direct us away from the present. So I'll just read this. It comes from the Screwtape Letters. Thought about the future inflames hope and fear. Also, it is unknown to people, so that in making them think about it, we make them think of unrealities. We want a man hag-ridden by the future, haunted by the visions of an imminent hell or heaven upon earth, dependent for his faith on the success or failure of schemes, whose end he will not live to see. We want a whole race perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end, and not happy now, but always using a mere fuel wherewith to heap the altar of the future, every real gift which is offered to them in the present. A man may be untroubled about the future because he's persuaded himself the future is going to be agreeable. As long as that is the real cause of his tranquility, his tranquility is only piling up more disappointment, because it isn't going to be that way, for him when his false hopes are dashed. A man must not be allowed to concern himself, this is the devil's strategy, with the present, because there and there alone, all duty, all grace, all knowledge, and all pleasure dwell. So now, to summarize this, Lewis, belief that God exists. I'm not going to go to the external world. I'm not going to think about whether the universe had a beginning or whether it's eternal in nature. He says elsewhere, I'm not going to look at to see if it's designed or it's not designed. I'm going to turn internally. I'm going to look at myself. I discover that I am a thing. A substance is the philosopher's term. I'm a thing through which changes pass, but I remain this same thing. And I don't have to exist, but I do exist. And what is the explanation for my existence? We're going to find it, he says, in the present moment, in the now. At 7:31 on a Tuesday night. I don't know the dates, I'll just say it's 7:31 on a Tuesday night, something like 7 March. And here's Lewis in his book, Miracles. In a pond whose surface was completely covered with scum and floating vegetation, there might be a few water lilies. And you might, of course, be interested in them for their beauty. But you might also be interested in them because from their structure you could deduce that they had stalks underneath which went down to roots in the bottom. The naturalist, he's talking about, we talked about the naturalist the past couple weeks. The naturalist thinks that the pond is of indefinite depth. So the water lily has a stalk, and the naturalist thinks the stalk just keeps going down and down and down. It never takes root in the bottom. There is no bottom. It's of an infinite depth. My claim is that some of the things on the surface show the contrary. These things, rational minds or souls reveal on inspection that they at least are not floating, but attached by stalks to the bottom. Therefore, the pond has a bottom. It is not pond forever. Go deep, and you will come to something that is not pond, to mud and earth, and then to rock, and finally to the whole bulk of earth and the subterranean fire. So Lewis thinks you're in the now, you're in the present moment, and you're wondering, why do I exist right now? Something must be keeping me in existence right now, because I don't have to exist right now. Students, when I would teach philosophy of religion, again, not very often, they're always pushing the question backwards. Well, I exist right now because I had parents. And my parents existed because they had parents. And they immediately start thinking, well, what explains my existence now is something, they start going back. They go back, and they go back, and they go back. Lewis, this is the work of the devil. He was talking about it in the future, but it's also into the past. You're immediately starting to go backwards in time, and Lewis says, no. The idea is you could have existed forever in the past. You could have been yourself an eternal being, but you would still be a contingent being. You would still depend on your existence at every moment in the past on what philosophers call a necessary being. The subterranean fire in Lewis's little image of this. You would depend on a being that never came into existence. It just always existed. And Lewis thought theology had lost touch with this idea. Your existence is not a matter of how long you've existed. I used to read this at Ursinus. I have a colleague friend back here, Peter. They used to assign us to read some of the slave narratives. And Frederick Douglass was a slave, and he concluded people were kept slaves because they were denied an education. He desperately wanted to learn how to read and write. And I'll never forget this passage. There's a passage in the narrative of Frederick Douglass where he was envious of other children because they knew their date of birth. Now think about this. They knew their date of birth, and he didn't know when he was born. And now take yourself right now. You've been told by people you were born on a certain day. Lewis, you probably just take that. Not probably, you do. You just take it on authority. Somebody's told you this. But imagine now, you discovered that you were actually born a day earlier than what you were told. Lewis, would this change your view that you're a contingent being, a being that depends on a necessary being for existence? Lewis, no, not at all. Imagine you discover you were actually born a week earlier than what you've been told. You've existed for a week longer than what you've been told. Would that change your view that you're a contingent being? Lewis, no. What if you were to discover you were born a year earlier than what you've been told? Would that change your view of yourself as a contingent being whose existence in the present moment needs an explanation? Lewis, no. And you get the idea. You're Frederick Douglass. You've been told, well, you were born here. Somebody finally tells you were born in this date. Then you discover, well, it really wasn't that date. It was a week earlier. It was a month earlier. It was a year earlier. Lewis, Douglass, in principle, could have been told that he was never born. And he would still think that he's a contingent being. Because contingency, here, you exist, but you don't have to exist. That's your nature. It's not a matter of how long you've existed. It will be an essential property of you, no matter how long you've existed. You require a cause of your existence right now for every now moment that you've existed. That's Lewis's point. Now, how significant is this idea that I'm a soul that exists right now, and the nows just pile up for however long they go? Well, I'm just going to read to you, I might have read this a couple weeks ago, radically different views of the self now, what it is. And it's no wonder, Lewis would say, these people do not believe that God exists. So I'm going to read to you Carl Sagan. Years ago, he had some famous documentary series on origins of the universe. But here's what Sagan's talking about the universe. Well, what does Sagan have to say about himself? Here's Sagan. I'm a collection of water, calcium, and organic molecules called Carl Sagan. You are a collection of almost identical molecules with a different collective label. But is that all? Is there nothing in here but molecules? Some people find this idea somehow demeaning to human dignity. For myself, I find it elevating that the universe permits the evolution of molecular machines as intricate and subtle as we, but the essence of life is not so much the atoms and simple molecules that make us up as the way in which they're put together. So Sagan, What am I? Well, I'm just a collection of molecules. I'm not a soul. So the view of the self, on Lewis's view now, will lead to an answer: does God exist or not exist? For Sagan, no. Why? Lewis, well, because he thinks he's a collection of molecules. Here's Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA. The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice may have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. This hypothesis is so alien to the ideas of most people alive today it can truly be called astonishing. Crick, am I a soul? No. I learned that in Psychology 101. Do I believe that God exists? No. Why? Because I'm not a soul. We know from Lewis's diaries and letters as a young man that he was interested in Buddhism. And a friend gave Lewis a book that was entitled The Gospel of Buddha. And here's what Lewis said back to his friend. The friend's name was Leo Baker, an undergraduate. Quote, "Thanks for the gospel of Buddha. Insofar as it is a gospel, an exposition of ethics, etc., it has not added much to what I know of the subject, though it has been very pleasant reading." Remember, Lewis believed you read for pleasure. "On the metaphysical presuppositions of Buddhism, it has given me new light. I did not realize before the Buddha's denial of the Atman." Now, the Atman is the soul. So Lewis says, I never realized the Buddha denied the existence of the soul. That is very interesting. I cannot present believe it. To me, the self, as really existing, seems involved in everything we think. No use talk of bundle of thoughts, etc., for as you know, I always have to ask, who thinks? Indeed, Buddhism itself does not seem to make much use of the non-Atman doctrine once it has been stated, and it is only by torture that the theory of rebirth is made compatible with it. Perhaps he's confused a moral truth with a metaphysical fallacy. One sees, of course, its inferiority here to Christianity as a creed for ordinary people. And though I sometimes feel that complete abnegation is the only real refuge, in my healthier moments I hope that there's something better. This minute I can pine for nirvana, but when the sky clears, I shall prefer something with more positive joy. Now, nirvana is basically the idea of absence of everything. This is going way back, okay? When I first arrived at Ursinus College, we had, I don't know if it still exists, we had a relationship with a sister institution in Japan. The sister institution was called Tohoku Gakuen University. And early on in my life at Ursinus, a professor came over from Tohoku Gakuen for a semester, and he was a Buddhist specialist. And so I thought, well, I can not only get out of teaching a class or two, always prof likes to do, get out of teaching a class or two. Actually, I'll let my students listen to somebody who's a specialist in Buddhism. And his name was Hiro, H-I-R-O, I'll never forget Hiro, Sakikawa. And I had Hiro come into 2 of my classes, and Hiro proceeded to explicate Buddhism and the doctrine that there's no Atman, there's no soul, there's just bundles, there's just collections of stuff. You think you're a self or an ego or a soul, but there really is no such thing on Buddhism. And what you're trying to do in Buddhism is meditate to realize that you really don't exist as something that persists through time. And people look at me and say, that's what it's, yeah, really, that's what Buddhism is about. Because Buddhism thinks pain and suffering is the problem of life, and pain and suffering arises out of a belief that you exist as a soul that persists through time. Because if you exist as a soul that persists through time, you want to get things for yourself. You want things to be mine. And this causes conflict. And you want these things because these things are sources of pleasure. And the Buddha, the idea is you've got to get rid of this idea of a belief in a self that persists through time. You don't do it through analytical reasoning, you do it through meditation. So Hiro got done the second class, and he was talking about reincarnation. And I'll never forget, I was sitting in the back of the class like some of you are sitting in the back there tonight, and I was watching the students. Girl stuck up her hand and she said, Professor Sakikawa, I don't understand this. She said, I just don't get it. He said, oh, yeah, he's always very. And she said, what don't you understand? If there is no Atman, if there's no soul, what gets reincarnated? Now, Lewis had problems with this. He tells us in this, he just doesn't understand us. And I watched Professor Sakikawa. I'm going to step away from the mic just for a second. Sakikawa rolled up his papers. And he walked back to the podium. Students did just what you did. They were chuckling, and I watched them. They were turning to each other, and Sakikawa said absolutely nothing. And what was he trying to communicate? Well, he was trying to communicate that you will never understand this quote-unquote system of thought if you're trying to analytically approach it. The only way you're going to make progress in Buddhism is to get out of the university and enter into serious meditation where you empty your mind of everything. Now, Lewis is thinking about this. He says, I can't believe this, that I don't exist. One other quick story, then I'll move on here. It was probably my second year at Ursinus. I still remember his student's name, David. I called David into my office because it was clear he was a good student, but his work was just deteriorating. It was just going down. Called him in, and I said, David, what is going on? And he said, I'm leaving Ursinus. I'm getting out. I said, okay. I've just had 2 students in the last month say they wanted out, and they want to know if I'd write them letters of recommendation to transfer elsewhere. And I said, sure, I'll write you a letter. David didn't want a letter. I said, but I'm naive. So I said, well, where are you going? Where are you going to transfer? He said, well, I'm not transferring anywhere. I'm getting out. I said, oh. I said, okay. I said, you mind just telling me why? I'll never forget it. I've become a Buddhist. I thought, interesting. Now, what else do we know about the self on Lewis's view? And I'm going to try and keep this fairly short. It's become known, it's actually now known by this, as Lewis's argument from desire. And where are we on here? Number 7. Lewis's, I just numbered them myself, second to last bullet point, Lewis's argument from desire. Lewis, again, he couldn't convince himself, because he was at a university, a Western university, he's thinking about this, he couldn't come to he said, I just can't believe that I don't exist as a persistent self. What does the self want? Well, we know from last week, it wants happiness of the most wonderful kind. We think of it as felicity, beatitude, perfect happiness. And I'm just going to read you now what he says. He was intellectually drawn to a view that provided satisfaction of the desire for positive happiness. We remain conscious, says Lewis, of a desire which no natural happiness will satisfy. But is there any reason to suppose that reality offers any satisfaction to it? Nor does being hungry prove that we have bread. But I think it may be urged that this misses the point. A man's physical hunger does not prove that man will get any bread. He may die of starvation on a raft in the Atlantic. But surely, a man's hunger does prove that he comes of a race which repairs its body by eating and inhabits a world where capable edible substances exist. In the same way, though I do not believe that my desire for paradise proves that I shall enjoy it, I think it's a pretty good indication that such a thing exists, and some men will. A man may love a woman and not win her, but it would be very odd if the phenomenon called falling in love occurred in a sexless world. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire for perfect happiness, which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. It makes no sense. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. Nothing will reconcile us to death's unnaturalness. We know that we're not made for it. So Lewis now is reasoning. He's trying to make sense out of things. He has a desire, he says, for perfect happiness. It isn't fulfilled here. It must be possible to have it fulfilled elsewhere, beyond this life. Why? Well, that's the only way things make sense. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, as I thought, as I read and try and think about Lewis, well, who are you to be trying to make sense out of things? Lewis, we all try to make sense out of things. We all try to fit things together so that they make sense. What does a naturalist have to say about the desire for perfect happiness. Does a naturalist deny the existence of this desire? No. How then, remember now, a naturalist is somebody like all of us trying to make sense out of things. How then does a naturalist make sense out of the desire for perfect happiness? Now, I'm just going to read you one naturalist on this, okay? To give you a flavor for what's going on. Guy's name is Eric Wielenberg. Teaches out in Indiana, the great state of Indiana, the Hoosiers. He's out in Indiana. And here's what Wielenberg says. The first important fact is that one of the main effects of the desire for perfect happiness is that it prevents a person from deriving lasting contentment from earthly things. This fact is important because deriving lasting contentment from earthly things can be quite disadvantageous, evolutionarily speaking. Dissatisfaction can benefit us in the long run. The idea is evident in Ronald Dworkin's criticism of the use of psychotropic drugs as a treatment for ordinary unhappiness. Dworkin labels the happiness produced in this way artificial happiness and observes that, quote, people with artificial happiness don't feel the unhappiness they need to move ahead, move forward with their lives. To see the evolutionary drawbacks of lasting contentment, now think about it, to see the evolutionary drawbacks of perfect happiness, consider a male human who's perfectly content as long as his basic needs, food, shelter, and sex, are satisfied. Once such needs are satisfied, you will have no motivation whatsoever to acquire additional wealth, power, status, or success. Indeed, he will have no motivation to do anything at all, other than perhaps ensure that his basic needs continue to be satisfied. Contrast this male with the second male, who has the same basic drives but who never achieves lasting contentment. Everything else being equal, the second male will likely do better than the first in the competition for limited resources. Evolutionarily speaking, a good strategy is never to be entirely satisfied with one's lot in life. Now, does the naturalist Wielenberg here say to Lewis, now think about this, does he say to Lewis, oh, you're a fool trying to make sense out of things? No, he doesn't say that at all. Given the desire for perfect happiness, we have to make sense out of it. Wielenberg, well, we'll try and make sense out of it, evolutionarily speaking. The possession of the desire for perfect happiness, which can never be satisfied, is what ultimately drives people to compete for the goods of this world, which results in their survival. One other example, everybody trying to make sense out of things. What about morality? Remember we saw last week, Lewis thought morality is not what it's all about. Morality will, in the afterlife, no longer hold or be needed. But how do we make sense out of morality in this life? Well, here's two naturalists, the evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson and the naturalist philosopher of biology Michael Ruse. What are they? How do we make sense out of morality? Do they deny that we believe in morality? No, not at all. They, just like Lewis, they acknowledge we believe in morality. How do we make sense out of it? Our belief in morality is merely, just quoting now, an adaptation put in place to further reproductive ends. Ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. It has no external grounding. The desire for happiness, how do we make sense out of it on a naturalist view? It's evolutionarily advantageous. How do we make sense out of morality on a naturalist view? It's evolutionarily advantageous. How do we make sense out of belief that God exists on a naturalist view? It is evolutionarily advantageous. At no point does the naturalist deny that we're trying to make sense out of things. We are. They posit their explanations as in an effort to make sense out of those things. Now, Lewis thought, and I won't go on, it's after 8, but Lewis thought that, well, if you take that position, what you're essentially saying is the desire for perfect happiness is unsatisfiable. And that's exactly what Wielenberg concedes. I will, if I can find this, read this to you. And I might not be able to put my finger on it here right away. But Wielenberg concedes that the fact that we can't satisfy the desire for perfect happiness indicates that in the end, life is ultimately absurd. So Wielenberg's take on this is, overall, everything has to make sense, but the fact that we can't satisfy the desire for perfect happiness makes sense within this overall framework. So Lewis, why believe God exists? Well, don't get preoccupied with the newspapers. Don't get preoccupied with the internet. Don't get preoccupied with all these gadgets. Try and find some time by yourself. Talk with others who are interested in this stuff. You might develop your thought on it. Don't get preoccupied with science. Science is something that changes. In Lewis's view, seriously, you could wake up tomorrow and the headlines be glaring at you. Earth now believed to be center of the solar system. You say, that's crazy. Well, yeah, things like this happen. Where do you, though, go in the end about belief in God? Lewis, he says, well, I go to myself. I wonder about myself. I exist. I don't have to exist. I need an explanation for my existence. The only adequate explanation in the end is a necessary being whom we designate to be God. I have a desire for something that just can't be satisfied in this world. Thereby I look to another world, and ultimately I look to the being who's going to provide the satisfaction for this happiness that I desire and cannot satisfy on my own in this life. But, Lewis would say, that doesn't get me to Christianity. It gets me to a belief in God, that the supernatural does exist. I'm a supernatural being. God is a supernatural being. But it doesn't get me to Christianity. Next week, the last talk, I want to look at why did Lewis finally become convinced that Christianity was the believable form of theism. Because you can be a theist and not believe in Christianity. What got Lewis over the finish line, in a sense, with regard to Christianity? I think it's fascinating. It actually changed, really, my intellectual life, this last bit on Lewis. I found it absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to stop there, and you're going to go, thank God. And you've been wonderful to put up with me for 3 weeks here. And do you have any thoughts or questions, comments? Peter. Well, because it's coming from you, I probably won't, but you go ahead anyway. Yeah, that's the great question of an academic. How does Lewis know that he's contingent? And I'm speculating here, okay? I've never seen him specifically address that question. I believe he just apprehends himself as not being necessary. So that it's the lack of the property of being necessary that entails, because the logical opposite of necessary is contingent. Not necessary just means contingent. And I believe Lewis would say that when in self-awareness, Peter, I'm aware of myself, I'm just aware that I'm not a necessary being. I lack the property of being a necessary being. Is there an argument for that? No, it's just something of which I'm directly aware. Arguments are needed for things of which one's not directly aware. I'm just directly aware of that. What makes God necessary? Philosophers, I mean, these are great questions. These are philosophy of religion questions. They're actually logical questions. Philosophers have generally concluded that there are different kinds of necessity, so that there is logical necessity, where if you deny a truth, it's self-contradictory to deny it. They talk about metaphysical necessity. I think Lewis was somebody who believed pleasure is intrinsically good, is a necessary truth, but it's not logically contradictory to deny it. So that there can be necessary truth whose denial is not logically contradictory. And I think Lewis believed that God is a being whose existence is not logically contradictory to deny, but there's something about God's existence which we probably, he's part of the long Christian tradition here, we can't see the nature of God. We can't apprehend it to actually grasp what it is about God's nature that makes God a necessary being. I'm inclined to think Lewis thought it had something to do with concepts needed a thinker, and thereby there had to be a thinker of concepts, because concepts themselves are necessary. But I think Lewis, best way I can at this point in time say is, I think in reading Lewis, he would say, we know ourselves better than we know God. And what we know about ourselves is we're not necessary, and thereby there must be thereby a necessary being. And we designate this being with the name, in our tradition, God. Lewis is a Cartesian. There are certain elements that his inward Yeah. Gentleman here says, I don't generally think of Lewis as a Cartesian. And some of you are sitting there saying, what in the world's a Cartesian? But some of what I've said tonight about Lewis sounds pretty Cartesian. Cartesian is just from Descartes, okay? René Descartes was a basically modern thinker, early modern era. And Descartes' most famous line, what is it? Anybody? I think, therefore I am. Yeah. And so Descartes, one of the books I was, after a student years ago said, I'm leaving college because I've become a Buddhist. I immediately started reading about Buddhism, and one of the first books I picked up, the first page goes after Descartes. This says, Descartes says, I exist, and the author of the book, a practicing Buddhist, says, no, this is. So, was Lewis a Cartesian? He was far more Cartesian than he was, say, Thomist, Thomas Aquinas. My first book I wrote on Lewis was to show, people often wonder, why didn't Lewis become a Roman Catholic? Lewis didn't become a Roman Catholic, I argued, because he didn't agree with Thomas Aquinas. The thought of Thomas Aquinas and the Roman Catholic Church to this day, its primary spokesperson to whom they appeal on so many issues is Thomas Aquinas. And Lewis did not intellectually agree with the thought of Aquinas to a large extent. Of course, you can always find something he'd agree with, but on certain critical issues, he just parted ways with Thomas. He was far more Cartesian. Lewis actually, I think, was tempted toward idealism. So Lewis would have thought that if there is no material, if we had to make a choice, arbitrarily choose here, are we going to be materialists or are we going to be dualists? We have material and immaterial things. Or are we going to be just idealists, just immaterial things? Lewis would have been an idealist. And there's certain things he writes towards the end of his life. Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. Boy, he says some things in there you'd think, he's an idealist. The only things that exist are souls and their ideas. So he, believe it or not, Lewis was very, in certain ways, Cartesian. Does he quote Descartes a lot? No. But the Cartesian framework is pervasive through Lewis. And seriously, one of the reasons I got interested in Lewis, people never paid any attention to this. But his argument for God, why he believes in God, it almost tracks Descartes. Now, Descartes thought that, why do you believe in God? Descartes argued, I go from myself to God, and then the material world. I mean, it was and Lewis at least goes this, I believe in myself, I go to God, but he never develops the Cartesian move from God to the material world. Yeah, it's time to go, isn't it? But as I often tell my classes, the last thank you is mine. I do enjoy Lewis. I find him fascinating to read. Thank you for putting up with me and C.S. Lewis.